Hey, I'm Charlie Thompson, and welcome to Chapter 5 on Language. So, in this chapter, here are the key learning objectives. We will look at how languages are distributed across Earth. We'll look at how languages are classified. We'll look at the distribution of the English language, where is it spoken? How did English become the modern lingua franca, a very important topic? How is English related to other languages? How are the Indo-European languages all related to each other, and how do we know? And why do people preserve local languages? So those are the key issues that we'll be looking at in this chapter. Some of the nuts and bolts of language. There's around 7,000 languages currently spoken on Earth. About 18 go extinct every year. By 2100, fewer than half of the languages spoken on Earth right now will still be spoken, which represents a tragic loss. Okay, this is a figure showing the importance of some Canadian place names, Indigenous peoples' place names, and it shows the relationship of the place and their language and their culture. And all of those things happen. This is in Canada. Another example I'm familiar with comes from an anthropologist who learned and lived with the Apache in the southwest of the United States. And in his book, Wisdom Sits in Places, it's filled with story after story and example after example of how their culture is transmitted via these stories, these myths, we would call them, these folk tales. And the folk tales took place like right there. It would be like if at American River College we were talking about the place where Arcade Creek turns just before it goes under the bridge. That would have its own name. The different bends in the river would have their own name. Different parts of that hill would have their own name. And their stories took place right there. And in this case, we've got examples of the Tidwiki sought refuge from the flood here. Right there. That's where these people took refuge from the flood. These people derived their name from the Gile, known in English as the Chicomen River. These people derived their name from the sheltered place. So all of these place names were very, very, very important. In the United States, most of these people, most of the Native Americans were either killed outright by warfare, by Europeans, killed by disease before the Europeans showed up in some places, and then by forcible relocation, when white people showed up and realized that Native Americans were living on land that we wanted, that we could use, we stole their land and forced them to live in places that we thought the land was worthless. So as a result of that, all of those place names and those stories and the languages, especially as Native American children were forced into government-run boarding schools where their hair was cut, they weren't allowed to worship in their religions, and they were not allowed to speak their language. So everything of their life was uprooted. They no longer lived in the same place. They no longer lived in the same way. They were not allowed to dress. They were not allowed to speak. They were not allowed to be the way they were. So let's continue on with language. Oh yeah, so I stole this from Wikipedia. It's from their table of all the languages currently spoken. And we've got language. Here's the rank by total number of speakers. We've got people that speak these as their first language, people that speak as a second language. We'll talk about this language, family, branch. Languages are organized, as we'll see, into groups. The groups are arranged into branches and the branches into families. And again, we've got it. Total number of speakers. So the most popular language in the world still right now is English. Although, if you want to look at the number of first language speakers, English is not the first. Mandarin Chinese would be first, followed by Spanish at 463 million. French coming in at number 5, total worldwide spoken. But in terms of primary languages, only 77 million people speak French as their first language. So there's way more people that speak Bengali and Russian and Portuguese. In fact, Urdu, there's almost as many people that speak just Urdu as speak French as their first language. So language, a system of communication through speech, communication of sounds that a group of people. We're talking about human language, although as the years go by, humans, we discover that we are less and less unique, that many animals have sophisticated language. I just read an article that wasps can recognize individual faces, which is a really scary idea. So yeah, a set of words and pronunciation methods of combining them used by a group of people. That's good. A dialect is a regional version of a language, and if you speak a dialect of a language and I speak a different dialect but of the same language, we should be able to talk and converse. There's some debate about looking at individual dialects. Is it a dialect? Is it a language? Languages are supposed to be mutually unintelligible. So if you speak one language and I speak a different language, we shouldn't be able to communicate. If we speak dialects, two different dialects of the same language, we should be able to communicate, though. So languages are supposed to be distinct. Because all the classification is done by humans, it's not perfect. Some places have official languages set by law in the Constitution or state laws. Lingua franca is a trade language. It's not necessarily anybody's first language. It's a language used for trade by people who don't speak that as their first language. Bambara in West Africa is an example. Also, Bambara is sometimes called West African trade dialect. So you wouldn't grow up speaking Bambara necessarily. You'd grow up speaking Dogon or Tuareg or Berber, but you'd also speak Bambara. A Pidgin language is a language made up from two different languages for the purposes of trade. And one of two things happens with a Pidgin language. Either it goes away because it's no longer needed, or it becomes a Creole. And a Creole language is a Pidgin language with rules, or Pidgin learned as a mother tongue. So while Pidgin may be a trade language, it's entirely possible that over time that Pidgin could become a Creole. People would learn that, for example, Haitian Creole, people would learn that as their primary language, in which case it would be a Creole, which is a language made up of two or more other languages. So this is the way languages are classified. The largest grouping is families. The families are divided into branches, the branches into groups, the groups divided into languages, and then the languages further subdivided into dialects. So again, languages are unintelligible, dialects are intelligible. So if we speak two different dialects of the same language, we should be able to speak to each other. If we speak two different languages, we shouldn't be able to speak to each other. So families, the roots of the families are prehistoric. And as you work your way from family to language, they get more and more specific. More and more recent. The breaking off of different languages and the forming of new languages occurs more and more recently. So a language family is a collection of languages related through a common ancestral language that existed long before recorded history. So there's no writing of these languages because they existed well before writing. One of the oldest systems of writing, about 4,000 years old. So writing is incredibly recent in terms of human history. I mean, humans have been doing agriculture for 10,000 years. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for 40 plus 100,000 years, and we've only had writing for the last 4,000 years or so. So a language branch, is made up of a collection of languages within a family related through a common ancestral language that existed several thousand years ago. So, for example, the Germanic branch of the Indo-European family. We'll look at examples of all this in just a minute, but a language branch thousands of years ago is when those languages broke off. The differences aren't as extensive or as old, and you can often find archaeological evidence that can confirm the branches derived from the same family. So the breaks in the branch happened within the last several thousand years. And then a group is a collection of languages within a branch that share a common origin in the relatively recent past and display many similarities in grammar and vocabulary. So like I said, some places have English as an official language, the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. Well, except English isn't the official language of the United States. Well, it depends what you mean by official. De facto, which means you're really doing it. Yes, it's a de facto. De jure means it's set in law. English is not an official language of the United States as set in law. In some other countries, for example, India, the Constitution lays out what the official languages are of the nation of India. Here's a different, this is, I think I stole this from Wikipedia. We've got English as an official language. So we've got places where they speak English, places where English is an official language and it's a majority language in that country. Other places official, but with a minority. Co-official with majority, co-official with minority. Not official, but with majority. Yeah. And then finally, just not official. So here is a pie chart. About half the world speaks an Indo-European language. These are families. So Indo-European, this is language families as the number of people speaking this language as their first language, or rather speaking a language in that family as their first language. About half the planet speaking an Indo-European language. Number 2, Sino-Tibetan, so the Chinese languages are all in there. About 21% of the world speaks a Sino-Tibetan language. Here we've got, this is a language family, and this is a super family with super prehistoric roots, showing that Altaic, Uralic, Dravidian, Afro-Asiatic, and the Indo-European families all had a prehistoric superfamily in Nostralic. Some of them, Japanese, it's a language and it's just off in its own family, and we don't really know what it's related to. Same thing with Korean. Same thing with Quechuan, spoken in South America. Same thing with some of the Nilo-Saharan languages. So let's break these down. We've got the Indo-European. So these then are branches: Indo-Iranian, Balto-Slavic, Romance branch, West Germanic. Well, there's the Germanic branch, and then the West Germanic group, and then the English language. We've got Austronesian languages, Javanese, Malay spoken in Malaysia, Sudanese, Malagasy. Malagasy, totally fascinating. Malagasy is spoken in Madagascar, but it's related to languages spoken throughout the South Pacific. Hindi, a big, massive in the Indo-Iranian, in the Indo-Iranian group, in the Indo-Aryan branch, and then the Sino-Tibetan with some of the Thai, Laotian languages, Chinese languages, Tibeto-Burman languages, Mandarin, the world's most popular single language, and then some African languages, Niger, Congo. And then the distribution of languages and some of the, well, the four, English, Arabic, Chinese, and Cyrillic, the writing systems. So Latin, our system, we'll just call that the Latin system, the Arabic system, the Chinese writing system, and then the Cyrillic, and how to say Wikipedia, although I think that's Wikipedia. Language families again. So all the TAN languages, English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Italian, Russian, Farsi, Urdu, Punjabi, Hindi, Marathi, are all in the Indo-European family. So half the world speaks an Indo-European language. The Sino-Tibetan family is the second largest family. The Altaic language family, I think, is one of the most interesting. So this is everything going from Turkey to Mongolia, and it brings us back to Genghis Khan. This is the spread of Genghis Khan across Eurasia. We've got Arabic languages, and then African languages with the Niger, Congo, the Afro-Asiatic family, everything from Hebrew to Arabic, some indigenous languages in purple and in green indigenous languages, green indigenous languages, Quechuan, the language spoken by the Incan Empire, with other smatterings of other language spoken by hunters and gatherers, probably, and we'll get into that. Hunters and gatherers. So hunters and gatherers, some remaining hunters and gatherers, some remaining hunters and gatherers. Those are the big language families. Another map showing the same thing. Here's the Altaic branch. The Uralic languages. Where are the the blue, the Uralic languages. We'll talk about those later. So we've got language families. This is the Wikipedia map. It's more detailed of language families, featuring the Uralic. Absolutely languages, absolutely fascinating. The distribution of languages. So the green is English, right? But the pink would have been spoken all across, the pink indicating it's some sort of indigenous Australian language. Would have been spoken across the whole continent before Europeans invaded and wiped out many of the natives in Australia. So there's little pockets of languages, little pockets of languages, little pockets of resistance. So English, let's talk about the origin of English, the diffusion of English. So we're going to go back to Celtic tribes. So starting off with a Celtic base around 2000 BCE, only a few words are traced back to the Celts. Later, we have the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes speaking Germanic languages showing up around 450 AD or 450 Common Era. We've got Germanic tribes from Denmark and northern Germany, moving the Celts out of the way. So we've got Angles and Saxons and Jutes in the 5th century. We already had the Celts, and the Celts are now getting pushed into Cornwall and Wales and Scotland. Celts being pushed down into Brittany, and we'll see that Breton is still spoken in that part of France, but it's related to Celtic languages. And then later, we have 1066, before 1066 with the Normans, we have the Viking invasions speaking other North Germanic languages. So these are West Germanic group. This is the North Germanic group, but people coming in with their words. And then finally the Norman invasion in 1066. So we've got Vikings between 800 and 1100. Didn't conquer Britain, but contributed a lot of words. But the Norman invasion, the Normans, the Northmen coming from France in 1066, they spoke French. The official language for the next, up until the Magna Carta, one of the changes with the Magna Carta was making English the official language again, reverting from French, which was the language of the noblemen, but not the peasants. So we have words for the animals. The animals' names are often Germanic or Celtic, but the names for the meat is from French. So we have cows and cattle from Germanic, but the meat is bœuf from the French. We have chickens, but they're poulet, poultry. So from the French, we get the words for the types of meat, and often from German, we get the names for the animals, because the peasants didn't learn German. The peasants were speaking some sort of Proto-English. The aristocrats were speaking French, and so the words for the food parts were French, but the words for the animals, because they were tended by servants who were speaking English, still are in English, or German-derived words. So that's a big part of the origin diffusion of English. We have these waves of immigrants bringing new words. The Romance languages contribute more than half of the words in English, either from French or through Latin, which is why it is so hard to spell English. If you're learning to spell English, it is so difficult, because so many of the words some of them are from Romance languages, some of them are from Germanic languages, and then some of them are from Celtic languages. So origin of English words, we've got Romance, Greek, Germanic, and other. And English is the modern lingua franca. Among other events, there was colonialism, and we'll look at, in fact, if we go back, If we look at the places, places where English is spoken, colonization, colonization, colonization. So as a result of going back to World War II, in fact, World War I and World War II, American and British troops went everywhere, all over the world, spreading English. We won World War II. Not that anybody really wins a war, but American troops occupied Germany, Europe, and Japan after World War II, and so people in those places were still learning English. In fact, you can go pretty much any place in Europe and speak English as an American, because so many people in Europe learn English, because it is the language of business. Why is it the language of business? Well, there was British colonialism. Follow that up with World War II, and then post-World War II, English on the internet. More than half of all internet content is in English. The computer languages that underlie the internet are all in English or based on English languages. Today, Mandarin represents 26% of internet traffic. It'll be interesting to see how that changes over time. English remains the dominant language of the internet today, but who knows what will happen in the future. So, hosts on the internet, the vast majority of internet traffic, well, half. So half English, about a quarter Chinese, and it'll be interesting to see how that changes over time. So these are countries that have English as an official national language. The countries that are purple, so again, Canada, a lot of African countries, India, Pakistan, using English as an official language. The US, Australia, it is the de facto national language. So as a result of colonialism, and then World War II, and then the internet, English is still the modern lingua franca, at least for today. There's a very good chance, just because of numbers, just because of sheer numbers, that Mandarin Chinese will be the next lingua franca by 2020. Yeah, that didn't happen. That date's got to be wrong. The Chinese is expected to replace English. We'll see. Let's just say English is expected to replace English as the most common online language. Oh, and one of the interesting things, we'll take a look at this towards the end of the chapter, is that Chinese is written completely different than English. Chinese is written completely, Chinese is spoken completely different. Chinese is a tonal language in which the tone of the word changes the word. In English, if you say a sentence sarcastically and you say a sentence not sarcastically, the words would still mean the same, but the meaning of the sentence would change because of your tone, like, oh, you look nice, as opposed to, oh, you look nice. So one of them is sarcastic, and it's clear that I don't mean that you look nice. I mean the opposite of that. And in fact, the same thing happens with tone in Chinese and also Thai, except the meaning of the word changes. There's a high tone, a low tone, a rising tone, falling tone, a flat tone, and depending on how you say the word, it means a totally different word. For example, number 10 or die or lion. She can mean the number 10, can mean die, can mean lion, depending on the context, what words it's around, and how it's said. English is an Indo-European language, along with the Romance and Germanic languages and the Indo-Iranian languages. These languages existed before there was writing. So we know that languages evolve over time, just like everything evolves over time. We know that languages evolve over time, but what we're left with are written languages, but we don't have any written examples of Proto-Indo-European, the language that eventually became all of these other languages. And so we have to use investigative skills to determine what languages are related and how exactly they're related and when they broke off from each other. So here's the Indo-European language, some of the branches on the Indo-European language family tree. So we've got the Romance branch, we've got the Germanic branch, we've got the Balto-Slavic branch, the Indo-Iranian branch, the Greek branch. Did I lose anybody? Oh, the Celtic branch. So They're spoken in Bretagne. Also parts of Spain and Galicia, they speak a Celtic language. And then, Albanian and Armenian. All of those are in the Indo-European language. They all had a common ancestor, 5,000-6,000 years ago. All of the Indo-European languages, there would have just been an ancestor, a Proto-Indo-European language. Hindi is very, very, very interesting. Hindi is related to English. It's related to German. So these languages are in the Indo-European language family, also Indo-European. These are older languages spoken by people who lived there before the Aryan people came in speaking Hindi, bringing with them the Indo-European language, their religion, as opposed to the older Dravidian languages and cultures down here in southern India. Again, so these Punjabi, Sindhi, Gujarati, Marathi, and Hindi are all Indo-European languages. All of these are dialects of Hindi. Then down here we've got Dravidian languages that predate those languages. Those people were there before the Aryans moved in with their new language and their new religion, which became the dominant language and religion of India. So here we've got the Germanic group, the North Germanic and West Germanic branches of the Germanic group. The North Germanic languages, Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish are related to each other. And then German, Dutch, English, and Frisian are related to each other. These four split off from these five, and we'll take a look at exactly when that happened. Icelandic is really interesting. It's a relic language. Iceland was settled about 1,000 years ago by Vikings leaving Norway. And as the result of the isolation, in fact, I've got this written down in the notes, but the idea that isolation leads to diversity. It's an incredibly important idea. I think it's up there with Waldo Tobler's. In fact, it seems derivative of Waldo Tobler's first law of geography, that everything is related to everything else, but things that are closer to each other are more related. So things that are closer to each other are more closely related than things that are farther apart. Iceland, off on its lonesome over here in the middle of the North Atlantic, didn't change. Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, English, German, those languages changed as a result of contact with other places, but Iceland just got stuck. And so over the last 1,000 years, Icelandic has not changed much. In fact, good day in modern Icelandic is identical to good day in old Icelandic, góðan daginn. Hasn't really changed because isolation leads to diversity. In fact, that same idea that isolation leads to diversity is how we ended up with, for example, the Romance branch. And we'll take a look at that in a minute too. Oh yeah, the Finno-Ugric languages, the Uralic languages, spoken in Finland and Estonia and in the Sami or Lapland areas here. Also Magyar, spoken in Hungary. So this Magyar and Finnish and Estonian and Sami and Nenets and these Samoyedic and Yurkagur languages, they're all related. So they would have been spoken across this whole larger area before the Germanic and Baltic languages came in. So Russian, spoken across Russia now, but would not have been spoken at all in any of these places. They would have been speaking a Finno-Ugric language. And then when Russian and the other Indo-European languages, because none of these are Indo-European families, these are Finno-Ugric, Samoyedic families. And when the Indo-European languages came in, the ranges shrunk until now Magyar or Hungarian is spoken in Hungary and a little bit of Romania. And in Romania, it's protected by mountains. So it's, again, isolation leads to diversity. The reason that it's spoken in Transylvania is because it's in the middle of a forest in the middle of these mountains. So there's less contact with the outside world, so that language persists there. Oh, this is just for kicks and giggles. You can read it if you want. I don't care. I grabbed it from Wikipedia because I had a student at one point that was like, really? Oh, The Finno-Ugric, those are a thing. So I'm all, oh yeah, let's find, yeah, you can read that on your own. Proto-Indo-European. How do we know, right? I already mentioned the Proto-Indo-European split happened way before we had written languages. So how do we know? Well, root words. The words for beech tree, oak tree, bear, deer, pheasant, bee, beaver, winter, snow, and ice, in all the Indo-European languages, they share an obvious identifiable common ancestor. However, elephant, camel, rice, bamboo, and ocean, across the Indo-European languages, they have obviously different root words. So the assumption is, if you have a thing, you have a word for it. If you don't have a thing, you don't necessarily have a word for it. So looking at the words that are common across the Indo-European family, it was a place that had beech and oak trees, they had winter and snow and ice, but not elephants, camels, rice, bamboo, or an ocean. There are two hypotheses for the Indo-European families spreading out across Eurasia. One of them is the Kurgan hypothesis. These are warriors. It's the idea that the language spread via military expansion, that herders from the steppes, the grasslands of Russia and Kazakhstan spread out across Europe. And as they dominated people, those people were forced to speak an Indo-European language. So the idea, it's really simple. I mean, it's very simple. Language was spread by military conquest. Began around 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, BCE, before Common Era. So the Kurgan hearth from the steppes, the grasslands, out across into Greece, and then down into Turkey, into Iran, and then into India, up north into Europe. So that's one hypothesis. The other is the Anatolian hypothesis. Anatolia is another word for Turkey. And it's a much more interesting idea. And the idea is that the language, this Indo-European language, was spread with the idea of agriculture. That as people stopped hunting and gathering and started doing agriculture, they started speaking a different language. So because this happened thousands of years ago, it's all based off of root words and archaeological evidence. The two theories, or hypotheses rather, seem to go back and forth. One will get more support, the other one will get more support. The first one will get more support, the second gets more support. I think right now the Anatolian hypothesis, along with some genetic, looking at human genetics, is the current leader. Here's the Anatolian hearth in present-day Turkey, and then again spreading out north into Eurasia, spreading out east into Iran, into Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and into India eventually. Yeah, there's a lot of different competing, well, there's two. This is a family tree of Indo-European languages, and the idea is that words in languages evolve at a given rate, and we can figure out what the rate of change is and use different words splitting off in different languages to backwards calculate how long ago that split happened. So yeah, first big split was Hittite and everything else. Second split was Tocharian and everything else. Then Greek split off, Albanian split off, Indic and Iranian 4,600 years ago. The Romance, Germanic, and Celtic languages split off from Balto-Slavic languages 3,400 years ago. So Russian and various other Russian languages split off roughly 3,400 years ago. And then we've got the breakup of the Romance languages about 1,700 years ago. A more detailed family tree showing when all of these splits took place, and then how, for example, the Celtic languages evolved into Irish and Welsh, Breton, how the Romance languages split into Sardinian, and then Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, Catalan, and then various French and other French Creole, Walloon, Provençal, French, and then Romanian. And then we are over here in the Germanic. So we've got Germanic. This would be North Germanic and West Germanic. We've got German, Pennsylvania Dutch, which isn't Dutch. Dutch, it's corruption Deutsch. It just means German. It should be Pennsylvania German. They're not Dutch, they're German. Some close-ups if you're at all interested. Oh, and then Italy. So these are, gosh, I just love this. Love, love, love this map. These are pre-Roman languages of Italy. So Latin spoken in this one little area. Here's some Etruscan, Ligurian, Gaulish, so that's French, Corsican, Sardinian, Sicilian, and then Greek on the coastline. So probably Greek colonies. So on the coast, people were speaking Greek, and inland they were speaking Oscan or Mesopic or Sicil or Sasanian or Elmian. But all of these languages eventually got replaced with the more standardized Latin spoken around Rome by Garibaldi, who tried to unite the entire country of Italy, which was small provinces. And one of the tools that he used was saying, hey, we're going to speak this one dialect of Italian, which is totally interesting because on one hand it worked and on the other hand it kind of didn't. In 2006, I was traveling and teaching in Europe. And in Italy, one of my kids had an earache, and we were up here in Tuscany. Perfect. And we went to the doctor, and the doctor was from Naples in southern Italy, and he said he'd been there for a couple years, and it took him a couple years. So he's still speaking Italian. It's just a local, he was speaking the Napolitan dialect of Italian. But he said it took him a couple of years to get the hang of understanding what people were saying to him. That the languages, the accents, the words, it was all so different enough that he had a hard time with it for a couple of years. And this is just 2006. So again, part of the reason that I find language so fascinating. And then we've got back to the idea that isolation leads to diversity. So you might have heard that all roads lead to Rome. All roads lead to Rome. Well, that's because the Roman road system, everything led back to Rome in Italy with the roads of the Roman Empire, which would have occupied, northern Africa and then the entire Mediterranean basin up into Portugal, Spain, up into France. All of that was occupied by the Romans. Well, around 300 AD, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, instead of people going back and forth to Rome, that just stopped. And so over time, this language, which would have been Latin, evolved into Portuguese. This is Galician. Catalan, still spoken today. It's a dialect of Spanish. France had a couple different dialects of French, Languedoc, Languedoc, Romanian. So all of these, so Romanian and Italian and Sardinian and the French and Spanish and Portuguese languages all came into being as the result of the breakup of the Roman Empire and isolation setting in these countries without people going back and forth from, for example, the middle of Spain to Rome to Spain to Rome, keeping the language consistent. It would be if we ran out of fossil fuel and electricity today, and we all just hung out wherever we are for the next several hundred years, over time, Northern California dialect would become much more different from Southern California dialect. Again, showing the Indo-European languages, everything from Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, English, Norwegian, Icelandic, and also Farsi and Pashto and Urdu and Tajik. Africa is interesting. To get your name on this, Arabic, Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, Efik, Fula, Akan, Sango, you have to be spoken by more than 5 million people. So these are language families. There's the Arabic, the Niger-Congo, the Austronesian, Malagasy. This language and the people, remember, came from over here in Indonesia. from the South Pacific. But there's no dominant language. There's no dominant language family. I suppose you could say Niger-Congo, but even within Niger-Congo, there's no like English or Russian or Mandarin equivalent. These languages are all spoken by a couple million people. So very, very different situation across Africa than across, well, the United States, certainly, but even more different than Europe, because these languages are so different and spoken by, to get your name on this list, you got to be spoken by 5 million people. So there's no dominant majority language. Here, just looking at Nigeria with different families. There's the Niger-Congo family. There's the Afro-Asiatic family, the Nilo-Saharan family. So we've got 3 families and a boatload of different languages. Other situations where this happens in the countries of Luxembourg and the Netherlands and Brussels, across Flanders and Wallonia, we've got Flemings, where they're speaking a Dutch dialect, and Walloons speaking a French dialect, Dutch dialect, French dialect, and then with protected minorities in each. Switzerland, also 4 different languages in one country. So we've got, I should back this up just a little bit and say, so there are cases most of the time, or at least most of the countries we're used to, there's like one country, one language, right? France, they're speaking French. Spain, they're speaking Catalan and Spanish. Portugal, they're speaking Portuguese. Germany, they're speaking German. Although there's different dialects of German, and they're often kind of difficult to get the hang of if you speak one, learning to speak the other. To say nothing of Schweizerdeutsch, the language, one of the languages spoken in Switzerland. So right now we've got like one country, one language. But in other countries, there's, I want to say 93 languages, one country. 1, 2, 3 different languages at least spoken in these countries. 4 languages spoken across Switzerland, with French, Schweizerdeutsch, a dialect of German spoken in Switzerland, Italian, and then Romansh. Quebec in Canada is French, or actually it's bilingual. Officially, French and English are the official languages of Quebec. And you can see in some of these places, 95 to 100% of the people in parts of Quebec are speaking French. Speaking French, and then speaking French. So you can see the effect of toponyms. So we've got French religious names on the Canadian landscape, telling us a lot about the people that settled and named these places. Dialects. So now we're going to move from language families and different languages being spoken in a country to dialects. Dialects in the United States. We've got different dialect regions. We've got Northern, Midland, Southeastern. The national diffusion of distinctive dialects is because of the westward movement of colonists from 3 East Coast dialect regions. They've been joined by a 4th dialect that developed in the West. So I would be willing to bet that if you grew up in California, you probably grew up speaking Western dialect. We've got North, Midlands, Southeastern, and they're differentiating between Inland South, Texas South, Charleston, and Florida as different dialects. One of your assignments is to go through the dialect quiz and figure out where the words that you use are from. Dialects in the United Kingdom and the UK, the result of those invasions of Angles and Saxons and Jutes going into different regions of England, settling, staying put. And then over time, those languages diverged, became more and more different. So again, it's the idea that isolation leads to diversity, that because there was an initial invasion followed by settlement and people staying in one place, in that place, those languages became more different relative to other places over time. It'll be interesting. I mean, I think of England especially, and the BBC has a great project where they're trying to get recordings of these distinctive regional dialects across England before they go extinct. Because now if you're watching TV, well, as a result of radio across England with the BBC, and the BBC accent is a variation on what's called received pronunciation. It's an upper class accent in English. So the broadcasters on radio in the UK and then later on TV all have the same accent, kind of like in the United States. You know, if you want to be a TV broadcaster and you have some sort of regional accent, like a Southern accent, you're going to do your best to get rid of it and just have a bland, placeless American generic accent. So, in England, as a result of the BBC and the received pronunciation, this upper class accent became broadcast all over the whole country. So now instead of, if you're in Southwest Cornwall, you would have only been talking with people who had your same accent. But now with mass media, this is changing with more mobility and people moving around for jobs. This is changing. It'll be interesting to see. In the future, I would imagine British accents will just sort of merge together to become one generic English accent instead of having all of these Northern, Midlands, and Southern accents. Oh, yeah. You've probably realized that US English is different from UK English. Those are dialects because they're the same language. It's just a local version of the same language. They differ via vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. That's always funny. Or was my favorite. Speed bump. Sleeping policeman. Speed bump? Ah, yes, they call speed bumps sleeping policemen. What happened? I ran over a sleeping policeman. What? Over time, those dialects can become languages, and that's exactly what happened with the case of the Romance languages, for example. Those languages started off as Latin, but over time became going from Latin to become Portuguese and Spanish and French and Italian. Isolation leads to diversity. Isolation leads to diversity. Over time, the differences between two places become more and more and more. The Romance languages began as dialects of Latin. Sometimes dialects they attempt to stabilize. Spanish, there's a Spanish Royal Academy. Portuguese, totally fascinating. 1994 agreement standardized Portuguese because Portuguese would have been spoken in Portugal, but most of the people speaking Portuguese live in Brazil. And then there's some African colonies where Portuguese is also spoken. So a 1994 agreement, they agreed to standardize Portuguese, except that they standardized it closer to the Brazilian version, which pissed off the people in Portugal. It'd be like if all the English-speaking people got together, had a big conference, and then decided, yeah, we're going to do it American. The new standard for English is American, and everybody in England's all, English is named after England. We're England. Why isn't our version the official one? And everybody's all, well, because there's only a couple 100 million of you, but there's way more people that speak the American version. There's way more people in Brazil, so we're going to go with the Brazilian version of Portuguese. I should point out French also has a Royal Academy that determines what words are French, and they'll issue press releases occasionally, like encouraging people to stop saying le toast and le weekend. And le Walkman. Don't use those words. There's perfectly good French words. Creole languages. So we've already talked about that, how you can get a dialect. Creole language, mix of two languages. So French Creole in Haiti would be a mix of indigenous languages and then French. Italy. Several languages in Italy could be considered dialects, but maybe they're languages because they're different enough from each other that now they're languages. Catalan, now classified as a distinct language. I remember back in 2006, driving across Spain. In fact, driving across Catalonia, there were a lot of examples of flags and billboards saying you are now in Catalonia. Not you're now in Spain, but you are now in Catalonia. different flag, different language. Valencian, classified as a dialect. They're trying to get that classified as a language. So Catalan, Valencian, 2 dialects of Spanish. Galician, many of its speakers would prefer it to be a dialect of Portuguese. Switzerland, we're done looking at Switzerland. Canada, French among Canada's 2 official languages. French speakers are a quarter of the population and clustered in Quebec. Confrontation is being replaced with cooperation. So a different map showing percent of French speakers. Nobody lives there. 0 to 5%. 88 to 100%. So Quebec, Montreal, very, very, very strong French presence. Every now and then, for years, Quebec has been trying to become an independent nation. They want to actually be separate from Canada. They want to have self-rule. Nigeria, I'm sorry, not 93, 521 languages spoken in Nigeria. Only 3 are used by groups of more than 10% of the total population. To reduce tensions, the government relocated the capital in the center of the country where none of these 3 languages predominates. Abuja, the capital. Niger, Congo, Afro-Asiatic, different ethnicities. Oh, yeah, I should also point out that not that these are languages, but the languages are also spoken by ethnicities. So these are groups of people speaking a language that is traditional to them, living in proximity to other people speaking a different language because they are ethnically different. Belgium, we already looked at Belgium. We're good with Belgium, the Walloons and the Flemings. The Flemings and Walloons. So we've got dialects, which are 2 different versions of the same language. Before that, we had branches and families. So now let's look at isolated and extinct languages. Endangered. Of the 7,000 odd families, 900 are dying. 1,400 are in trouble. So yeah, about 3,000, 1,000 dying, which probably means that they're spoken by a few old people. And it could be as few as tens. An extinct language was used, but is no longer in use. Latin, well, except Latin they actually use. So we'll go with revived. The loss of many languages. So there's at least one video I'm going to assign for you to watch about the loss of languages and what we lose when we lose a language. Dot map showing some of the places of endangered and extinct languages. Native American languages. Over 300 Native American languages were spoken across the United States. Many of those are on their way out because there just aren't, there's nobody left to speak it with. There might be a handful of speakers, but nobody's learning it as a new language. Isolated languages are some of the most interesting. Basque. Basque is totally unrelated to the other languages around it. It's not related to them. In fact, the Basque people say that the Basque language is a very, very, very old language. They say that when God wanted to make Adam and Eve, he went to a Basque graveyard to dig up a skeleton to use as a model. That's how old the Basque language is. And indeed, it has been spoken there for thousands of years before the Indo-European languages replaced it around the regions where Basque is currently spoken. Welsh was the dominant language of Wales until the 19th century with the enclosure movement, industrialization, and English speakers migrating there. To help preserve the language, Welsh is a required subject. Road signs are in Welsh. They now have BBC programs in Welsh. Irish, also official language of the Republic of Ireland. English was imposed when the country was a colony of the United Kingdom. Irish is now preserved, like Welsh. Breton, spoken in Brittany. Around 225,000 people speak Breton regularly. Not recognized as an official language in France, however, that's unfortunate. Scots Gaelic, around 100,000 people speak Scots Gaelic. Cornish, spoken in Cornwall, became extinct. Dolly Penreath was the last native speaker of Cornish to die. Her last words were recorded, and her last words were, and I always wondered, did the person writing them down know at the time what she was saying, or did they she's talking, so I'm just going to write it all down and I'll figure out what she's saying later. But her last words were, "I will not speak English, you ugly black toad," which on her deathbed, kind of a last piss off. You've colonized our people. You've forced us to speak another language. You've dominated our political processes. You've dominated our economy, but I won't speak your language. So percent speaking a Celtic language. Here we've got Ireland speaking Irish. We've got Welsh in Wales. We've got Scots in Scotland, and Cornish in Cornwall, and Breton spoken down in Brittany in France, Celtic people there. Preserving lesser used languages. Across the EU is trying to create programs to preserve minority languages, broadcasting, multimedia. Sometimes languages can be revived. Hebrew is a good example of a language that went extinct. No one was using it. It was brought back, and it's now one of the country's two official languages, one of the two official languages of Israel, along with Arabic. Miami. No one has spoken this as a first language since the 1960s, the language of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. Daryl Baldwin is trying to bring it back. They've created an online dictionary. So here he is teaching, and some of the words, a guide to the nature. Learn your trees. Learn the names of your trees. Occasionally we discover new isolated languages. That'll probably happen less and less over time. New languages. Koroaka, a Sino-Tibetan language spoken in northeastern India, discovered in 2008. How do you write a language? I said we'd get back to Chinese. So languages written, we went over the four different writing systems: Latin, Chinese, Cyrillic, and Arabic are the dominant there's alphabetic languages and non-alphabetic languages. With an alphabetic system, the symbol stands for a sound. With a non-alphabetic, for example, ideograms, the symbol doesn't stand for a sound. The symbol is standing for something else that has meaning. So languages, again, with literary traditions: Cyrillic, so Russian, Ukrainian; Latin, English, French, German; Arabic, and Chinese, the four big writing systems. So here's some ideograms. These are radicals. So son is a radical, person is a radical, and then by modifying the radicals or combining the radicals, you can make compound words and modified words. So by modifying son, you can get white or clear. By modifying person, you get big. Heaven, above the biggest person, white person. Daytime, clear. So the ideogram for clear plus heaven is daytime, but you can also make it by combining clear with sun. So I alluded to this by saying that the word's meaning is not, if it's being spoken, it's not only tonal, but also contextual, like what other symbols is this being used with that would help you understand it. A lot of the languages around the world are non-alphabetic. They do not have a system of writing. And there's a group, the Ethnologue, started by the Summer Institute for Linguistics, and they are devoted to translating the Bible into all of the languages in the world and then presenting a Bible in a language that people could read, which I would argue is an act of cultural imperialism. For example, when we've talked about the Hawaiian language, the words in Hawaiian often have like multiple vowels. They look different from English words because it's not their alphabet. That alphabet was made up by missionaries, by Christian missionaries, who then imposed that alphabet and that system of writing upon them. It wasn't asked for, it was forced upon them. So the idea, and I got to say, it's a radical idea, the idea that there is a benefit to being illiterate. That there are a couple of studies of people who still can remember, like Homer, the big deal with Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad, those great great Greek tales, those were oral. Those are told. Those were spoken word. You would just remember the whole thing and rattle it off, but it wasn't written down. And there's some evidence that learning to read and write actually changes the wiring of your brain and prevents you from being able to remember those things anymore. I think it's also interesting that in the Wayfinders video, Mao Piailug said that none of this is written down. Paper no good. What happened if the paper run away? What happened if the paper get wet? No, you keep it all up here in your head. So I think it's interesting that Polynesian navigation is part of the oral tradition, that the Homeric epic poems were part of an oral tradition. They weren't written down. They were retained in the mind. And that's it for languages. I hope you enjoy languages. I hope you enjoy the videos. I hope you enjoy the assignments. I wish you a great week studying language. If you have any questions, please come to Zoom. I would love to chat with you about anything involving human geography, but languages are super interesting. And that's it.